this is your first time joining us, you have missed out on an incredible set of Black History Month events where we've been celebrating Black scholars, leaders, and change makers from across North America. All throughout the month, these events have been empowering, educational, and it's been a true honor to host them. I would like to thank the planning committee, which included myself, Dr. Bergeron, and Fayo Abdi, and the countless people who supported us, including Dr. Tamaj, Vesna, Ginger, Aurelie, Nikki, Jen, and the entire Equity and Diversity Committee here in the Faculty of Arts. Thanks to these amazing people, we also launched the first Black History Month Creative Arts Gallery, which showcases countless pieces of art, poetry, research, dance, photography, and even film. But none of this would have been possible without the financial support of the Dean's Office, who is more than willing to support Black History Month initiatives this year, and hopefully till the end of time. So I will place a link to the gallery in the chat for everyone to view. And if you happen to miss any of our past events, you can find some of the recordings on our website. So I dropped them all in the chat for you to refer to moving forward. So before we introduce today's powerhouse speaker, I'm going to establish some ground rules. For today's event, we'd kindly ask everyone to keep their mics muted to eliminate any background noise. Aside from that, please turn on your cameras and share any of your specific questions with us in the chat box. And if you have any urgent technical issues, please write a request in the chat and a support member of our committee will reach out to you. And now I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Pallavi Banerjee, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology, who will provide us welcoming and opening remarks, as well as a territorial acknowledgement.
Thank you, Ebenezer. I'm really pleased to be here. So welcome students, staff, faculty, community members to this outstanding opportunity to celebrate Black History Month this February. So before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. I would also like to note that the University of Calgary is situated on the land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and the traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohickanist, which we now call the City of Calgary. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And now to thank a few people, first of all, Dr. Suzette Mayr for accepting our invitation to participate in our faculty's event as part of our series celebrating the Black History Month and sharing her insights with us today. And then the Faculty of Arts and the FOA Equity and Diversity Committee for sponsoring this event, which is the Faculty of Arts, and the EDC organizing group and the Dean's Office staff for organizing the event. So today marks the last day of the faculty's 2021 Black History Month program. Over the past few weeks, we have hosted 5 unique events centered on kickstarting exciting conversations with Black trailblazers across North America. As a faculty, we are committed to innovate and promote excellence in academic programs, student experience, and community relationships. We acknowledge that diversity, equity, inclusion, indigenization, and human rights have to be at the core of this mission. Dr. Suzette Mayr, now to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Suzette Mayr is the author of 5 novels, including her most recent, Dr. Edith Vane and the Hares of Crawley Hall. Her 4th novel, Monoceros, was longlisted for the 2011 Giller Prize and has been translated into Italian and Turkish. Her novels have won the ReLit Award and the City of Calgary W. Mitchell Book Prize, and has been nominated for the Commonwealth Writers Prize for Best Book in the Canada-Caribbean region, and the Writers Guild of Alberta's Best First Book, and the Best Novel Awards, and the Ferro-Grumley Award for LGBT fiction. She has published articles in horror studies, Canadian literature, studies in Canadian literature, the Journal of the Association for the Study of Australian Literature, and in Antipodes. She teaches creative writing at the University of Calgary. And now our esteemed guests, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Suzette Mayr.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. And I want to say first off that I support the territorial acknowledgement that came earlier. So I'm going to share my screen with you here. And I'll begin by saying that it was really difficult to write this talk. And I swore at you a couple times, Ebenezer and Marie-André, in the best way. It was really difficult to write this talk. It was difficult in ways that I could not have predicted when I was asked to present as part of the Black History Month events and celebrations. In part, it's because one of the things it was suggested I might do was discuss my upbringing and roots, or rather discuss how my upbringing and roots have influenced my creative writing research practice. Thinking about how my upbringing and roots have influenced my writing means that I have to venture into the murkier parts of my own creative process. And pinpointing the process of creativity is never an easy task. Creative writing, as I practice it, involves a lot of research, but there are also those magic aha, eureka moments that bring all of the research scraps and ideas together into an interesting and viable, coherent project. And how I achieve those eureka moments is not always predictable. This is not an uncommon problem for many writers. Oops, let me just get oh, here we go. Somerset Maugham once wrote that there are 3 rules for writing a novel. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are. And all I can say is I concur. I absolutely agree. The big goal that I am always working towards when I write is getting to that eureka moment, that marvelous spark or that sequence of sparks that transforms a mundane collection of words, that disappointing pile of papers on my desk, that mound of library books and digital files full of word sketches, into an actual story that will serve as the supermotor for writing a full-length novel. In terms of my upbringing and roots, I suppose the kindling for that spark, those moments of eureka spark, comes from something that Nobel Prize winning writer Toni Morrison once said, which is that if you find a book you really want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And this is one of those things I have in my writing area, just on a sticky note, just as a reminder. The books I want to read are books in which I can see myself and people like me reflected back, affirmed, and not in ways that are about Black pain or Black trauma, that aren't stories about slavery or brutality, or that only feature African-American experience as though there is no other way to represent Black identity. And I realize it's ironic that I'm, referring to Toni Morrison, who is an African-American writer, but I kind of have a magpie approach to those things that inspire me and help me write. And I'm not writing off African-American writing or culture at all when I say this. Coming to understand what kinds of books I wanted to read, and therefore what books I felt I needed to write, took a long time, and it was a bumpy, dusty ride. So here's some information about my background. My mother is from the Bahamas. My father is from Germany. They met in Ontario when they both came to Canada in the 1960s. They moved to Calgary to work, for work, and I was born in the Calgary General Hospital. I went to elementary, junior high, and senior high school in Southwest Calgary. And growing up in Calgary, I was one of only maybe 2 Black kids in every classroom. And sometimes I was the only one. I grew up with the sense that there was no one like me and my brothers. And, during that awkward period of growing up when I, like a lot of people at that age, when you're a teenager, for different reasons, of course, when I just wanted to fit in. So in addition to being the only Black kid or one of only 2 Black kids in the room in every classroom, I started figuring out I was queer while I was a teenager, finally coming out for the first of many times when I was around 21 years old. In the gay and lesbian bars, as we called them back then, in the gay and lesbian bars in the Calgary scene, there was really no one like me. There was one other woman who appeared briefly at the bar. Poetically and appropriately, her name was Phoenix, because there was only one of her too, but she lived in Edmonton, and so she didn't stick around. So there was no one like me in the city where I lived, in the books I read, or in the media I consumed. African-American TV and movie culture was interesting, but it was nothing like my lived experience. And I was really missing that. But even though, you know, I felt like I was the only one of my kind, ironically, years later, I have come to learn that I wasn't the only one who felt like I was the only one. Alberta writer Tomi Ajele, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, recently wrote an essay in the Huffington Post titled, "2020 was the year I stopped trying to live up to others' definition of Blackness." In this essay, she writes about growing up Black in Canada, but of finding nothing but African-American role models for how to be. She writes, quote, "Whether I was watching a movie with a token sassy Black woman or settling into Coach Carter for the 5th time, the portrayal of Black culture in the media I consumed was terribly consistent. If you were Black, you were funny, you had a tragic yet redemptive story, and most importantly, you sounded Black, but that wasn't me," end quote. Novelist, or rather fiction writer, Andre Alexis builds upon this and another piece of writing by suggesting that, quote, "It sometimes feels as if no one, Black or white, has yet accepted the fact and history of our African Canadian presence, as if we thought Black people were an American phenomenon that somehow crept north or an African one that migrated," end quote. Black people living in Canada come from wildly different backgrounds and different histories, largely as a result of different waves of settlement and immigration. What happens for a lot of Black folk, as I mentioned before, in Canada, is that African-American experience is held up as the culture to emulate, but it is an incomplete and ill-fitting model. So even though Tomi Ajele, Andre Alexis, and I are all Black, and we are all Canadian, we are all very different. Ajele is 2nd generation Nigerian. Andre Alexis was born in Trinidad and Tobago, but grew up in Ottawa. And there is no one monolithic homogenized Black identity. And this is really important to understand and know. So this feeling of not fitting in and of being anomalous punctuated a lot of my adolescence. And it wasn't until I hit university really that this thing I call the Great Interruption with capital letters occurred. It was two events that together became one of those defining moments that draw the line between what came before and what came after in my search for self. The Great Interruption was 2 courses I took in the same year while I was doing a bachelor's degree in English here at the University of Calgary. One was an English course taught by Jean Perrot titled Writing by Women of Color, and the other was Fred Waugh's creative writing poetry course. Writing by Women of Color was unlike any course I had ever encountered throughout my entire school life. Jean Perrot does not identify as Black. She is not Black, but she had done her research. She had done her due diligence as a reader and a scholar, and she was passionate about the material. And this was not a tokenistic treatment of writing by racialized women. This was a full immersion in and commitment to the material and the writers. And one day there was resistance among the students in the class about the material. Or rather, one day when there was resistance, I suggested out loud that perhaps, I was trying to be a good girl, I suggested out loud that perhaps students would have trouble accessing the material because so few of us were women of color. I think I was the only one. Perrot promptly asked all of us why, as readers, we were expected to have no problem suspending our disbelief and understanding of what it was like to live on the Yorkshire moors in the 1840s while reading Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, but somehow reading the material for this class was more alienating. And in hindsight, what a great question that was that she asked us that day, and what a great answer that question was as well. So we read the work of writers I had never heard of before, but that I adore to this day, such as Zora Neale Hurston, Mary Helen Washington, Alice Walker, Paula Gunn Allen, Leslie Marmon Silko, Anne Petrie. And I learned in Jean Perrot's course about the artistic and literary movement of the Harlem Renaissance, which lasted from around 1910 to the 1930s, where a huge group of Black artists from around the world came together and made really important and significant art. We also in this class learned about writers like Jean Rhys, who, although not a woman of color, wrote from her perspective as a white woman who was born and raised in the Caribbean outside of the Imperial Center. So Jean Rhys is the author, for people who don't know, she's the author of Wide Sargasso Sea, which is a rewrite or a revisioning of Bronte's Jane Eyre, but from the perspective of Bertha, the mad woman in the attic, who was a white woman from the Caribbean. So to be frank, I have to be upfront here. Dr. Perrot's course made me really uncomfortable because with all the material being written by and starring BIPOC women, I felt that, that these books put a spotlight on me as one of the only Black students in the course. But on the other hand, they put a spotlight on me as one of the only Black students in the course. People like me were the star and the author of book after book after book. And how freaking amazing was that? These books were so beautifully written. The characters were so full and so textured. Slavery as a topic was included, but maybe only in one or two of the texts. And so I was really proud that I might be identified with these women. And I couldn't help but feel seen. And I love the warmth of that spotlight. So being in that class was like discovering there was an entire branch of my family tree that my relatives hadn't bothered to tell me about. There was a whole tradition, a whole new history, a whole new range of possibilities, and a skill set, a new skill set for a budding writer. And it was different from what I'd seen on television and in the movies and what I'd been taught so far in school and university. Around the same time, so there's a second part to this great interruption. There was Jean Perrot's class, and then at the same time, around the same time, Fred Waugh's poetry course was upending my relationship with language as I knew it. Being a poet, Fred Waugh is deeply suspicious of language. He was a rigorous taskmaster in that class. He hated cliche, he hated traditional lyric poetry, and he was a mixed race writer, writing about what he called living in the hyphen of being Chinese, Swedish, and Scots-Irish, what he called the hyphenated existence. So as a biracial writer myself, to hear my experience identified and given a name, hyphenated, was remarkable. And to be invited to explore that space through creative writing, to understand that language, to understand truly that language was manipulable and manipulative as a medium, was the greatest gift. So these two courses, these two instructors, these piles and piles of books and poems I was charged with reading and finally with writing, these were essential to my understanding of who I was as a person and who I was as a writer, as a beginning writer, even though I'd barely begun my path as a published writer at that time. And for the first time, I was not an anomaly. I had a home and I had a place in literature. My experience of having that electrifying moment of being seen, of being spotlit, is not unique. Writers such as Agel, who I mentioned earlier, Alberta writers Karina Vernon and Cheryl Fogo all write about a moment when they realize that they aren't alone, that they aren't the only one, and that their voices are important. So for example, part of Agel's journey to the realization that she was no longer going to live up to others' definition of Blackness was reading of Karina Vernon's Black Prairie Archives anthology, which is on the screen here, and Cheryl Fogo's Pouring Down Rain, a Black woman claims her place in the Canadian West. Agel also writes about discovering Michelle Pearson Clark's Suck Teeth composition that pays tribute to West Africans living in Canada. Reading the books by Fogo and Vernon, seeing the art of Suck Teeth composition, Adele writes that these writers and artists, quote, illustrated such uniquely Canadian experiences. And for the first time, I felt like my existence wasn't a deviation from Blackness. It was a part of it. Seeing myself represented in literature and art told me that I could be me and be part of Black culture at the same time. For her part, on her part, Karina Vernon, the editor of the Black Prairie Archives anthology, stated recently, she had a recent interview on CBC, where she said that her moment of being seen, or what she says of no longer feeling disorientation, came when she was a grad student, and she found in an archive a matter-of-fact description from the 1800s by William Francis Butler of a Black fur trader named Dan Williams paddling a canoe down Alberta's Athabasca River. In that CBC interview, Vernon said, quote, I grew up feeling like an anomaly. I really thought that my sister and I were the first Black kids to step foot on prairie soil, and that can't be further from the truth. She goes on further to say that she was thunderstruck by this discovery in the archives, by Francis Butler's description, because, quote, it places Blackness inside, first of all, a canoe, the very icon of a certain kind of Canada, and it historicizes Blackness in that place, end quote. Vernon researched and wrote the Black Prairie Archives anthology as what she says, quote, a gift to the future, so that future kids wouldn't grow up with that feeling of estrangement that I grew up with, end quote. And I just love that phrase, future kids. Finding some of Dan Williams' preserved writing, Vernon says it completely altered the direction of her life. She says, quote, if Dan Williams wrote, how many others were there and how many of them wrote? It finally gave me a language for my own identity. I could think of my own identity and history connected with this archive. I could think of myself as a Black prairie person at last, end quote. One other book that was really important for me in terms of understanding my place and my story, and the books I wanted to read and write, was Cheryl Fogo's Pouring Down Rain, which I referred to earlier. Even though I came across Pouring Down Rain after I'd finished my bachelor's degree in English, it was still before I'd written my first novel. And this book was electric for me because it was written from the point of view of a Black woman who'd grown up in the neighborhood of Bowness in Calgary in the late 1950s and the 1960s. The writing by women of color course that I'd taken with Jean Perrot had concentrated very heavily on American literature. And here, suddenly in Pouring Down Rain, was Cheryl Fogo's story, letting me know that she had come just shortly before me in my very own city, that Black people lived in Calgary, that they had lived in Alberta for generations, and that there was family here. And I'm putting family in quotation marks. I mean that in the loosest sense, or the most encompassing, inclusive sense. So Fogo's work was an inspiration for me. She continues to be an inspiration for me. Her work was an inspiration for Tomi Agel, who I mentioned earlier, and unsurprisingly, her work is included in Vernon's Black Prairie Archives anthology. And Fogo cites as one of her moments of self-recognition the discovery of John Ware. So Fogo, her documentary John Ware Reimagined was part of the Black History events this month. So I hope you get a chance to see that if you weren't able to watch that film at the time, when it was scheduled rather. So for her part, Fogo cites one of her moments of self-recognition, the discovery of John Ware, the Black cowboy who settled in Alberta and raised a family here, in a part of Alberta not far from where Fogo's own family settled, leading Fogo to feel that John Ware is what she calls an ancestor. And that's another word that I think is just fabulous. Fogo has gone on to write a play and a documentary about Ware in order to provide a reevaluation and retrieval of this historical figure from racist historicization. So just to do a bit of a switch here, the concept of ancestor in the way that Fogo uses it lies very much at the root of a novel that I'm currently working on, which has the working title, The Sleeping Car Porter. So to return to that quotation of Toni Morrison's that I cited at the beginning, I understand this call from Morrison to also be about finding ancestors, finding family, meaning biological family if possible, but also chosen family, artistic family, kindred spirit family, those people who have come before you and who began mapping the way, and those who will come after you, the ones that Karina Vernon refers to as the future kids. So here is my story about my novel in progress, The Sleeping Car Porter. Here is the story about my search for a family member, my search for an ancestor. I have a great uncle who was born in the Bahamas. His name was Baxter. He was recruited by the Canadian Pacific Railway in the early 20th century to come to Canada and work on the trains as a sleeping car porter. Young and looking for adventure, he arrived in Canada where he worked for a number of years on the trains. Sleeping car porter work was pretty much the only kind of good work, or relatively speaking, well-paying work that a Black man could get at the time. Baxter is recorded nowhere in the family papers. He likely appears in no archive unless it's as a criminal, named or unnamed in a police record, because he was caught out for gross indecency while in the company of another consenting man, which is the only way a man like him would be recorded in an official archive. Or maybe he's not in the archives because he found the right guy and he lived happily ever after. Sometimes these things do happen under the radar. People like Baxter worked hard not to be found. I tell you this story is truth about my ancestor, even though it is 100% fiction. Baxter is the main character of my novel in progress, and I am writing him because he is the star of the book I want to read that no one has yet written. I write him with the zeal of someone searching a family garage or a cupboard or an attic or an archive for traces of family members whom she didn't know existed. I made up Baxter, but I made him up because I am the only queer person I know in my Caribbean family. But not for a minute do I believe that I'm actually the only queer person in my Caribbean family. I'm also not the only queer Black person in the history of Alberta or the Canadian prairies. I know that archives are tricky places. They are places that have been curated and controlled. And it's not a coincidence that for a long time, I couldn't find a single thing about queer Black men in Canada, like my ancestor Baxter. As Jose Esteban Munoz writes in his book, Cruising Utopia, The Then and There of Queer Futurity, queerness has an especially vexed relationship to evidence. Historically, evidence of queerness has been used to penalize and discipline queer desires, connections, and acts. When the historian of queer experience attempts to document a queer past, there is often a gatekeeper representing a straight present who will labor to invalidate the historical fact of queer lives, present, past, or future. Queerness is rarely complemented by evidence, or at least by traditional understandings of the term. Perhaps evidence of Baxter was dismissed as not important or worth recording. Perhaps his trace was erased by a gatekeeper wanting to maintain a straight history. However, perhaps the silences in archives are deliberate. I can't just assume that the reason I can't find someone like Baxter in the archives is because that evidence is being withheld. The poet Norbezi Philip writes that, quote, silence marks lack of neither language nor identity. Rather, it is a form of communication that those who rely on the hegemonic word of private authority cannot hear, which I think is really provocative. Karina Vernon, again, from before, writes that Black archival practices respect that the archivist is not entitled to everything, and not everything is for the public archive. In searching for archival evidence of a gay sleeping car porter upon whom to base my novel in progress, I run up against at least four different kinds of silence. The silence of a gay man looking to stay hidden, the silence of Black people not wanting to be co-opted by a white archive, the silence of the Black sleeping car porters in general. They're a group of men who are very protective of their reputation. It's very hard to crack that circle. And possibly the fourth silence is the silence imposed by the official keepers of history who did not deem the lives of Black gay men worthy of archival inclusion. I have been researching this book about Baxter for 20 years. I remember, this is just unbelievably embarrassing, but you know, thing, it is what it is. I remember referring to this novel during my job talk when I interviewed for my job here as assistant professor at the UC back in 2003. For many years, this story was just an embarrassing sand dune of papers and books strewn about, paper-clipped papers, stapled and unstapled papers. Part of my difficulty with writing this book is that I've had so much difficulty trying to prove that this story could have happened. That has been my journey. While doing research in the University of Winnipeg archives, for example, I read in the archives database that the archive had in its collection a box of transcribed hard copy interviews with gay working class men, just a little younger than Baxter would have been. And I was so excited by the prospect of this box. I was sure that I'd found my lump of gold, that I'd found my spark, not even a spark, that I'd found my bonfire, that I would find an ancestor or ancestors. And I sat in the main room of the archives waiting for the box to be delivered to the table, to my table. The archivist delivered the box and I thought, this is it. I opened the box and the box was empty. I asked the archivist where the contents were. I was told that the files were restricted because of the wishes of the interview subjects or their families. And as much as I pleaded, the archivists did their job as they should and wouldn't let me read a single file. Thinking about that empty box always makes me kind of emotional because I realize that even at the age of 80 or 90 years old, those men were still afraid of being found, or their families were ashamed of them. Another difficulty I've had, perhaps related to the four silences I mentioned before, was the unfortunate struggle that Langston Hughes mentions in his 1926 essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. So in this essay, Hughes writes about the special challenges of the Black artist. He says, quote, "The Negro artist works against an undertow of sharp criticism and misunderstanding from his own group and unintentional bribes from the whites. Oh, be respectable. Sorry. Oh, be respectable. Show how good we are, say the Negroes. Be stereotyped. Don't go too far. Don't shatter our illusions about you. Don't amuse us too seriously. We will pay you, say the whites." One woman who lives in Vancouver who has relatives or had relatives who were sleeping car porters, and I didn't know this woman, but she heard about the plot of my novel, about the premise for my novel, and she accused me of being a racist just for conceiving the story of Baxter. So in an email to me, she said that my premise of a gay sleeping car porter sleeping with a passenger on a train was wrongheaded. She wrote, and this is part of a longer correspondence, "In my view, I feel there's a brand of racism implied in even the idea of that story conceit, and it reveals a total lack of understanding of the 19th and early 20th century politics of race." I was, needless to say, I was very discouraged and I was frustrated. My story about Baxter wasn't real. His story could never have happened. There was never a gay porter. No porter would have ever slept with a man on a train. And once again, I was the only one. I was an anomaly. But I also knew, and I always knew, that I couldn't be the only one. It just didn't make logical sense. And I read and reread what playwright Jeremy O. Harris said, which is that for the Black artist, quote, "You need to make Black art for your Black self and hope that it connects to other people's Black selves. I spent so much time worrying about all the ways that my Black play wasn't connecting with certain Black audience members that I was ignoring the Black audience members that it was connecting to. When I speak to artists, especially artists from oppressed groups, I see them necessitating this self-censorship. And I'm like, no, be free. The only time you can be free in this world is when you're writing." And then, coincidentally, while scanning an article on gay cultural history in Toronto, I came across the following snippet of police record. In 1920, Edward L., a janitor, was arrested by police after having had sex with a train car porter in the lavatory of the Grand Central Hotel, a few blocks from Toronto's Union Station. Edward asked his boss if he would write a letter to the court testifying to his good character. A spark. This was a spark. Knowing what I knew about porters and that they were almost all Black men, I knew that the train car porter caught with Edward L. must have been a Black man. I contacted the author of the article, a historian at the University of Guelph named Stephen Maynard, and he told me that the porter's name was Davis, and that, yes, Davis was a Black sleeping car porter. He was in his mid-40s, married, a Baptist. His sexual partner was, as far as I can discern from the surviving records, a white man, a janitor, also in his mid-40s and married. Davis was sentenced to a fine of $200 or 3 months in jail. His partner, despite having the character references, got the same sentence. It was a light punishment compared to many. I always imagined the even bigger punishment to have been the public exposure. What, for instance, did they tell their wives? This was another spark. I attended, and I'm talking about, when I talk about sparks, I'm talking about, it's sort of, my process is sort of as a magpie as far as creative writing goes. So it's just sort of like picking pieces here and there and interesting serendipitous moments, coincidences, and then having these coincidences create these moments of electricity. So following this, I attended the Calgary Institute for the Humanities, or rather I attended a talk held by the Calgary Institute for Humanities, a talk by George Chauncey, the American history who wrote the book Gay New York, Gender, Urban Culture, and the Making of the Gay Male World, 1890 to 1930. And I did not know George Chauncey at all, but I thought I would tell him about my dilemma. So there was the wine and cheese afterwards. I thought, I'm gonna go talk to that guy. And so I went up during the reception after the talk, and I told him about my situation. I told him about my doubts and about how a sleeping car porter in 1929, would never sleep with a passenger. And George Chauncey gave me one of the broadest smiles I have ever seen and said 2 words, Sumner Wells. Sumner Wells was an American diplomat who in September 1940 solicited Pullman car porters for sex when he was taking a train from Jasper, Alberta to Washington, DC. The next spark, Melanie Boyd, a librarian here at U of C, gave me an article from a 1928 issue of the Psychoanalytic Review, a journal devoted to an understanding of human conduct, in which the author, a former porter, had written an article called The Pullman Porter Looks at Life, and reports on the instance of, quote, a nervous young fellow of 16 offering a porter $5 to submit to onanism, end quote. So here's another spark. An article by Sage Mathieu, who's the author of North of the Color Line, Sleeping Car Porters in the Battle Against Jim Crow on the Canadian Rails, mentions in passing that the Bahamas is one of the places in the Caribbean where Canadian railway companies recruited Black men to work as porters in sleeping and dining cars, in spite of this recruitment being outlawed because of racist policies against allowing Black people into Canada. And I had a moment of, my mother's from the Bahamas. Maybe I had an uncle who answered a recruitment call. I continued on my hunt and I found this poem. Langston Hughes wrote this in 1925. I loved my friend. He went away from me. There's nothing more to say. The poem ends soft as it began. I loved my friend. I moved on. I looked at work by Essex Hemphill, who wrote in an essay in 1990, just listen, your brother is speaking. Yes, that is your father, cousin, uncle, son sitting amongst us. He too has a story to tell. I have heard it before. It so gently begins, I loved my friend. Black men have been longing to kiss one another and have done so for centuries. The last completing spark, the final eureka, the beautiful bonfire, because after all, when you're writing a novel, you need more than just a main character and a sex scene. That's not going to carry 250 pages. Was this, So this just fell from above. Via Rail apologizes to passengers as train delay reaches 45 hours, which I love this. Via Rail is apologizing to its passengers who are currently on a cross-country trip 45 hours behind schedule, saying the delays are beyond our control. We understand the impact this major delay has on our customers, and we apologize for the inconvenience they cause, said spokesperson Mylène Bélanger in an emailed statement. At the time the statement was issued, the train was located near the town of Valemount, BC, west of Jasper National Park. My ancestor Baxter does indeed exist, and now he has a story. The story of how he slept with a passenger on a train when it was delayed for 45 hours in Banff National Park. So I switched it to Banff, took it away from Jasper. So I'm gonna start winding down this talk with just a few final thoughts. Sci-fi writer Connie Willis says that, quote, literature is the people who went before us, tapping out messages from the past, from beyond the grave, trying to tell us about life and death. Listen to them. I am listening to messages from the past. I am making Black art for my Black self. I am not an anomaly. I am not alone. You, future kid, you are not the only one. You are not an anomaly, and you are not alone. Local activist and artist Adora Enwarfor says that we shouldn't call Black History Month, but that instead we should call it Black Futures Month. I plan on hopping on that bandwagon and accepting a mission I've been given by the writers who've come before me. Dan Williams, Mildred Ware, Essex Hemphill, Zora Neale Hurston, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Langston Hughes, my contemporaries, Cheryl Fogo, Karina Vernon, Tommy Agel, and so many others. I will hop on that bandwagon and I will write into the future so that one day I too can be someone's spark. I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional here. I've been asked to propose concrete policy to help highlight the importance of acknowledging Black voices in storytelling, creative writing, and academic spaces. So as a professor of English literature and a novelist, this is what I recommend, or this is what I propose. That we read more books by Black authors, that we read about Black experience that is not confined to stories of trauma and slavery. Black people have been slaves, but they have also been florists, computer programmers, elevator technicians, drag queens, and in my novel, Dr. Edith Vane and the Hares of Crawley Hall, Black people have been proudly mediocre professors at haunted Alberta universities. Read one Black authored book a month for a whole year. I dare you. It's so much fun. If you are a Black person, reading books by Black authors or books by non-Black authors who've done their research will help you with your own spark, whether you're an artist or not. Really, sparks are just about those moments of connection and inspiration. If you are not a Black person, I also urge you to read these books. Why? Because if you only read segregated literature, then you are seeing an incomplete world and you will not flourish as fully as you should. You will never know your full potential. Reading these books will help you with your sparks. Pre-pandemic, there used to be a campus book that every member of the U Calgary campus was urged to read in a given year. A great start, this is just something I'm proposing, would be to have a campus book for Black Futures Month or Black History Month. For example, in the Department of English, we also have a policy where every first year class has to include at least one book by an Indigenous author on the syllabus. While this is just a token gesture, I still think it's a great start. And I've personally pledged myself to teach at least one book, if not more, by an Indigenous author in every class I teach, no matter what the level. So why not extend this to including a book by a Black author in every first year course? Further to this, my experience in Jean Perrot's Writing by Women of Color class was just so empowering and so just so remarkable and invaluable to me because it went beyond tokenization. And I know this might not work across all of the disciplines, but you know, if it does work in your discipline, is it possible to have a course that is dedicated 100% to writing or work by BIPOC authors, scientists, or researchers? If not, why not? And this might be a question to work on finding an answer to. So I'm going to stop now, or rather I'm going to conclude by reading to you a short excerpt from the novel in progress, this novel about my ancestor. If I can find it. Here it is. Yes, here it is. Okay. Okay, so the title is The Sleeping Car Porter. It's a novel in progress. And the scene I'm going to read you is not a happy scene, but do know that the manuscript has a happy ending. So this is one of the bumps that the characters have to go through in order to reach their happy ending. The last time Baxter saw Edwin Drew, his former porter instructor, was leaving a Toronto barbershop in a laneway in the dark. Baxter walking by himself down Albert Street, then Edwin smoothly following behind him in step. Baxter turned into the Albert Street lane. Edwin turned into the Albert lane too. Standing together, huddled in a doorway, Edwin's arm over his shoulder, their hands gripping and stroking each other, their knees weak when the policeman's voice erupts. Baxter's hands wet with Edwin Drew, his fingers dripping with love. The voices blast in his skull. Baxter ran. His lungs fevered and blistering, his feet skimming packed dirt, spur tracks, wooden boardwalks, bricks locked into dusty, elaborate puzzles as he rounded corners, streaked past the department store, past warehouses, past factories, running and running even after the pummeling footsteps behind him evaporated. He ripped off his eyeglasses as he ran so he wouldn't lose them, clutched them until the wires twisted, the streets and lights and people blurring as he swerved around them, nicked and bumped them with his shoulders, his elbows. He ran until the gassy streetlights disappeared. He ran into the dark. He ran into the trees. He ran onto the railway tracks. He crouched on the tracks, heaving for breath, his forehead down on his knees, until he heard the low whistle of a train and he leapt away. In the darkness, he disappeared. In the darkness, Edwin Drew disappeared. Edwin Drew was popular and sociable and upstanding and a good Christian and laughed too loudly with his big, perfect teeth. Baxter was a nobody with bad eyes and recessed incisors who only seemed interested in Martians and Weird Tales magazine. Edwin Drew, 40, married, his wife and children moving in with her brother in shame. Edwin Drew, a Baptist man, incarcerated with $200 bail, his name blaring in the newspaper. Baxter read and reread his books and magazines about the deep sea and Martians and outer space and time travel and immortal beings and phantoms. He ate alone. He ironed his shirts. He shined his shoes so they glittered like stars when he walked. He floated under the sea. He circled the planet Earth in his spaceship. He flew up high on the back of giant scarabs from Jupiter. He rested in the cellar of his castle in his box of dirt, friends with Dracula's vermin and baby-feasting vampire women. He sat on his stool in the speeding train, his back perfectly straight, and he slept with his eyes open, a caul draping his face, a tittering insect instead of a heart. Edwin Drew, the best porter instructor in the country. He played poker like he invented it, slapping down his cards and shouting himself into a win. Edwin Drew disappeared. Thank you.